You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our super generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by
Tracy McMillan with Nelson Nygaard.
Hey, Tracy, welcome back.
Hey, Jeff. How are you doing? It's been a minute.
I know, it's been a minute. I mean, I can't believe that the last time I saw you was in November, but also I feel like I don't even know what the last time you've been on the show. And that's, like I said before, that's on me because I'm really bad at planning these things. But how you been?
I have been good. I am also I'm trying to recall the last time that I was on the show. How old is your daughter? Because I feel like it was before her birth.
She's almost 2.
No, it hasn't been that long. Maybe it has been that long.
I don't think so.
Know.
I don't think so. Yeah, she's almost 2. So that's crazy, right?
Yeah, right?
Time flies. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I think it could have been as long as that because the past 2 years have been super busy with work and life and everything. And so I know we attempted a few times, but had to reschedule.
Yeah.
And things happen.
It's how it goes. It's how it goes. It's how life is. But you're back now, so we're happy to have you back now.
I'm excited. Yep. And I've said I want to get back on the regular schedule with it.
Yeah, we need to get back into it. There's so much news that's happened. And it's funny, I mentioned on one of the most recent shows that I went to China for. I've been talking about it for a lot in the newsletter and everything. But there's just so much, I was gone for a month and I was like, oh my God, so much stuff happens in a month and I couldn't believe it. So I was like, every 2 weeks seems reasonable when you're gone for more than a month and you come back and you're like, oh, I have way too much to talk about. And we definitely have some good stuff to talk about this week. I'm glad to have you back. And how are the puppies doing? How is the kids doing? How is everything going?
Everything is good. Everything is good. I don't have a 2-year-old. I now have a 16-year-old, which is a whole different experience.
Oh my gosh. I don't know if I'm dreading getting there or it's been to be a while, so I'll wait till
everything changes. And you'll be happy to know he has discovered track, though shorter distances than you did.
Yeah.
But that's been a lot of fun to see that love of track settle in with him.
It must run in like your genes or something, right? That's how it works.
I don't know. Yeah. Certainly, he got it from his father's genes, not me.
But you like to run too. Like it's not a.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. But yeah, everything's good. The puppies are good. They're passed out behind me. So
nice. Tired.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It started to get warm here in the Valley of the Sun. So
yeah. So I want to ask about Phoenix too, because I saw you at Impact when I was there. It's also very different weather than here in the Bay Area. And I was walking around and it was pretty comfortable, even though it was pretty hot. How do you deal with the kind of that level of heat throughout the year? I was chatting with somebody on the podcast about I think when I talked to them, had been like 110 plus degrees for like so many days. And I was like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think I know you had Ryan Wozniak on maybe last year. And I don't know if you've spoken with any of the urban resilience teams and extreme heat teams that the city of Phoenix has now. City of Tempe has a strong sustainability program, and other communities in the valley are really adding more of that programming. And I think that's one of the keys in terms of how to support the community as a whole in that regard, being sure that there are cooling places that are accessible to people and any other programming that can be done to help people maintain cooling in their homes. In a normal year, like last summer was abnormal. We didn't really have a monsoon season. I was thinking about it earlier this week that in a normal year, we do have the months right about now that start heating up. Sometime in April, May through June, will get warmer and warmer. And then hopefully in July, we have a monsoon season that starts. So you may start the day warm, but you have your thunderstorms that come in and can provide some cooling. And you go through that for a couple of months, and then maybe you have another warm month, and then you come into a normal fall and winter, which is cooler. And so when you were here in November for impact, we were kind of coming on the tail end of, a warmer, drier year, but then it's been a normal and wet and cool winter and spring. Like it was in the 70s this weekend, which was nice, but I don't know. It's the weather everywhere has been inconsistent, not following
it's weird
trend patterns. Yeah.
It's weird.
Yeah. Like in the Bay Area, was it a wetter winter?
Yeah, it was a wetter winter. We had a lot more rain. And I think that's probably going to change as the El Nino pattern dissipates, right? So we had a couple of years where we had a good amount of rain, and then it'll probably get a little dry again, and got to get those rain barrels set up. So I can save some stuff for the lemon tree out back.
Yeah.
But yeah, I imagine it'll get drier, but we'll see. Well, let's get started. All
right.
Thanks to everybody who has been ordering Bus and Bike scarves. We thank you very much. Go to theoverheadwire.com at gmail.com, or email me at theoverheadwire@gmail.com if you want to get 5 or more. And you can go to theoverheadwire.com and order them. We can also hook you up with some t-shirts, like our Cars Are Cholesterol t-shirt, bit.ly/Cars Are Cholesterol. Also, all the books that we review and the folks that we've talked to, their books are in our bookshop's shop, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. Check that out if you get a chance. This is episode 151. We are live and together and in session, although not together. You almost came, you're almost here, which is how we got back into the groove a little bit, but we'll get you back in. We'll get you back in to the studio at some point, but we're live together and in session. And before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that you can get this podcast or Talking Headways on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Pocket Casts, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Wherever you find your podcasts, you can get this show. So let's get started with the news. I mean, there's a bunch of news. Obviously, when you're on, we don't do like 100 articles, which is a good thing because then we get chatty. So it would last like 4 hours, and nobody wants that. But there's a lot of stuff to cover. So let's start with aging in place. Older Americans who believe they would be able to sell their homes to downsize are feeling stuck. As property taxes and homeownership costs increase, older populations are increasingly feeling the burden of a lack of affordable, diverse housing options. This was by Paula Spann in the New York Times. Yeah, so I felt this was an interesting article just because we've been talking about kind of insurance and the housing crisis and shortage and all that stuff. But there's this huge group of people that has already or is about to retire, have a lot of their net worth is in their house, but they also have a place where they want to live. And some of them want to downsize and many of them can't.
It was a really interesting article. I learned quite a bit, like in terms of the challenge of the decisions that people make in terms of financing and the things you have to think about in terms of how you might approach financing and continuing to pay on your mortgage if you have the ability to be a homeowner and as you are aging. I mean, having parents that are aging and continue to age and have either been forced to make a decision or have made a decision to move over the past several years. And, at times we felt like they should have done it sooner to not be trapped in a sense, as the article laid out, or because of health reasons, having done it sooner. The article really resonated with me. And it is something that I know people are feeling as a whole. I think there might have been an article in the San Francisco Chronicle recently too, in terms of the phenomenon of, because of the higher interest rates, people also not leaving their homes because of that. And they are staying in the homes longer. And I think that's part of what the article talked about too. So even that limits the housing inventory as a whole. And then we have the challenge of not having as many new builds hitting the market and those new builds coming in at a higher cost. So unfortunately, it creates this situation.
Yeah. Those golden handcuffs are tough because there's so many people. I think, Emily Badger, I think it was, wrote an article in the New York Times about how there's like just an unprecedented amount of people who have super low interest rates on the houses that they live in now. And so there's no way they can leave without jumping up like 6 points or so, 7 points. Five is probably more likely. They're probably 2.5, 3 mortgage, and right now it's 6 and 7%
Yeah.
So that's a big jump in terms of your monthly payment. Even if you downsized your house, that's still, not an insignificant amount. And then with rising insurance rates and kind of inflation happening too, the inflationary pressure, you have that too. And that they talk about that in the article too, like all these rising costs in addition to your house. It kind of makes it hard if you're in a good situation right now. Like, why would you leave and go somewhere else? But as you said, aging in place, I mean, that's one of the things that I get frustrated too, because I feel like there's a lot of advocates in California who are like, well, you've lived in the same place for a long time, so you've built up a ton of equity in your house. You're worth a lot. You could just sell that house and use that money. And it's like, well, yes and no. Yes, you have, that it's an illiquid asset, right? So you can't just like transfer out that easily. But also, like, you grow up and you live in this place for a really long time, and then you have this community that you've built up too. And so I know that if we're thinking about Mindy Full Love's work on root shock and things like that, there's a whole thing from displacement that affects people and their mental health and things like that. But also people like my grandmother, who lived in her house for a very long time until she was 109, and she was blind, for most of the last part of her life, in the last 20, 30 years. And so, her moving out of her house would have been a non-starter, right? Because she knows where everything is in that house because she'd lived in it for so long. But if she moved to a new place, that's just like not really tenable to push her to somewhere else. And actually, when she was like 103, she broke her ankle, and she went to the recovery facility for a few months, and she was like, she hated it so much she tried to recover as fast as can so she could get back in her house. So and it's amazing that she was able to heal that bone at 103, which probably is the reason why she lived to 109. But but those types of things, like, I feel like we need to give people more grace in that discussion, because there's a lot of like pressure from housing advocates. There's a lot of pressure from the discussion about housing in California and everywhere else in the United States that's like kind of pushing people. And I don't want to push people. I want to allow them to make decisions that are good for them.
I had come to be uncomfortable with the term aging in place. When I was at UC Berkeley, SafeTrek, we did a survey of older adults in Alameda County and Contra Costa County. And we were kind of teasing out that aspect of aging in place and the challenges that exist when you begin to lose the opportunity and the ability to travel independently. And the tension that exists with the mental aspect of and the challenges of losing that independent travel, how it affects you mentally if all of a sudden you have to move from a location that's familiar to you or constrained in that space. So we can too often throw around terms and ideas such as aging in place and how great it is, but there's a lot more to it and complexity to it from the individual standpoint, as well as, like we were talking about, from the housing market standpoint. Is there some place to, one of the couples featured in the article, what they had hoped to do was to stay in the same community, but to downsize into another smaller property with lower cost and lower square footage. And that doesn't exist. Again, and partly because we're in this situation right now where that starter home or that smaller home that they might want to go into, people aren't leaving because of the interest rate situation and the lack of new housing coming into the market. So aging in place is more complex than the phrase would imply, for sure.
Yeah. And that's that's something that the article makes pretty clear too, is that they wanted to go. They had their sights set on going, and then that housing stock isn't there. And like you said, like the starter homes, the smaller places, those are hard to get because you have people who are first-time home buyers want to get into those places because they're less expensive. You have folks, you have institutional investors that want to get them because they're cheaper and you can just kind of grab a bunch of them. And you have all other types of pressures that are going against that model. And even, in places like San Antonio, I've seen recently where they're building really, really tiny houses, right? Like those are actually really far out in the suburbs because that's where you can build. And so that's another problem too, is like, where can you build any of these houses? Because we don't allow the missing middles to actually happen.
We have a project we're doing with the city of Buckeye, Arizona right now, a transit feasibility study. And it is a suburban community about 30 miles west of Phoenix. And they were in one of our meetings with them recently, they were commenting on that there are developers that are building there that are building like in-law suites and casitas, accessory dwelling units, because it really more designed to be multi-generational housing, because that is what the market is asking for in the area. One, because from a cultural standpoint, there is a desire to have that, and two, because of we've talked about it for 5 years, as you know, almost the length of time you've been doing the podcast about the baby boomer generation and the way the age pyramid is inverted at the moment.
Yeah.
So in that community, actually, when we had done an event at the senior center recently, there were a number of individuals that had talked to us about how they are living with their grown children now. They had moved from Chicago or New York or wherever, Minnesota, and now they're living with their grown children in Buckeye, and then their transportation challenged because they're not driving anymore. So they could not age in place, but maybe there is housing that's being developed that allows them to age in a new environment.
And that transportation aspect of this is really important too. I mean, thinking about how people move around. When my grandmother had to give up her keys, she voluntarily did, because I think she scared herself. I think she might have, we don't know what she did, but she scared herself to where she gave my sister her keys. But that was kind of a challenge too, because she lived in kind of a suburban part of Contra Costa County. You could bike or get there if you were more mobile, but obviously at the time she wasn't. So she'd have to take the county connection, which was the paratransit, and that at the time that was not as smooth, I think, as it probably is now with all the technology, what the ride hailing companies have kind of brought to the forefront in terms of on-demand rides and that type of thing. But so it was frustrating. So it was hard because, my sister would go grocery shopping for her. I would go grocery shopping for her at times when I lived over there. And so, come once a week, and then her friends would come and visit and play bridge with her and all that stuff, but she couldn't go anywhere, right? She had to depend on other people. And so I think that's an important part of this too, because our built environment, as we've talked about since we met, is really tough for that, right? I mean, it's really designed in a way that's very car centric. And we're going to have Anna Zevarts on to talk about her books that's coming out soon. One of the things that we had her on before too is there's so many people like Anna who can't drive, and there's a larger percentage than people think. And people, when she tells them the number, I think it's a pretty big number. It's like 20-30% or something like that. They're like, no, that's not really, that can't be true. And it is. And even if you include children too in that, because they are people who need movement as well. And there's a large number of people that can't drive. And so we've designed the system around cars, and it's really tough to get out of that. And people are going to find out, if they hadn't thought about it before, they're going to find out real soon how tough that is.
Yeah, and that's why I think we're seeing it is a contributing factor to the growth of some of the microtransit systems that we're seeing be developed across the country. There is a greater latent demand of people that can't drive or choose not to drive. It's a bigger number, like you said, than people really estimate. And programs like a microtransit service, an on-demand service, is really filling demand that was out there.
Yeah.
And providing important access, and in places where fixed route maybe has not been viable before.
Yeah. Yeah, and it just doesn't work. We actually just talked to Jarrett Walker this on last Thursday, and so he has some opinions on fixed route versus microtransit. But there are those places, and I think he might agree and says so on the show, that there are places there where it makes sense because that's the only thing that's available. But for the most part, we haven't designed the fixed route transit actually works in a lot of places too. So in any event, there's so much to talk about.
Yeah, and some of those places can evolve. I mean, with now that if they then see demand, maybe it could eventually evolve back into evolve to fixed route. But yes, we could talk about that, or I could bring on some of my colleagues to talk about it, and Alyssa too, because I'm not the expert. But I was going to say, this is in talking about aging in place, and I know I've mentioned it on the podcast before. My in-laws used to live just outside of Nashville, Tennessee, and they were on 24 acres, and they were really resistant to moving because they wanted to age in place, but it was hard to get a caretaker in to live with them. So we needed to move them eventually because there were issues of dementia and Alzheimer's, which is one of the other articles that we're going to talk about. So they are in a we put them, they are in a memory care community now, which is a great environment for them. But again, it was that resistance to change and the fear of the unknown for sure, and loss of independence that was really difficult to get over.
Yeah, it's scary.
Yeah.
Scary. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a bit. Let's go to Nashville, shall we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nashville mayor unveils transit plan. Yeah, since we're in Nashville, right?
Yes, that's right.
Let's go to Nashville since we're already there. On Friday, April 19th, the mayor of Nashville, Tennessee released a $3.1 billion transportation plan that includes transit improvements and complete streets upgrades for the city. The proposed improvements would be funded by a half-cent sales tax that voters need to approve in a referendum this fall. The plan includes 54 miles of upgraded streets with priority bus treatments, and property would be purchased near major transit nodes for transit-oriented development. The plan makes funding available to double bus service beyond existing levels. This was by Cassandra Stevenson in the Nashville Tennessean. There's a lot to like in this plan. The big thing for me, though, is they're coming back for a second run at a referendum. The first time was struck, or at least the last time they did it, it was struck by the fact that the mayor who was pushing it got into a big scandal right beforehand. The advocates that were working in the city really pushed up hard against a lot of the folks who were saying that AVs were right around the corner, which they're still not here yet. and they had
Nashville.
Nashville, and they had some big plans, right? I mean, they wanted a subway tunnel underneath downtown for light rail. They had some bus rapid transit plans. They just kind of went for the fences, and then they had a couple of trip ups. But this one, the mayor has actually kind of downplayed it a little bit. He's actually a trans advocate himself from his before life. Before he was the mayor, he was a big time walkability and transportation policy advocate. And he's like, okay, well, we got to do something here that helps us get to the next level. And I found this very kind of refreshing from a certain standpoint. I like myself some good light rail, some subway, some bus rapid transit, some big ideas. But at the same time, like, I also like doubling bus service. I also like the idea of transit-oriented development and the transit agency purchasing properties all around the transit centers so that they can do that themselves and build affordable housing and things like that. So there's a ton of stuff in this plan, but I find that kind of low-key, let's just invest in ourselves and see what happens, and then maybe we can go big next time. I like that mentality for this, where they are right now.
And I agree. It seems like a much more reasonable plan, and hopefully, there are extenuating or exogenous factors that affected the vote last time, because it seemed like they had good momentum for a while.
It felt like they did, yeah.
And hopefully that also is, certainly lessons learned in terms of their next steps as they prepare for the referendum. We're going through we'll have a transportation sales tax on the ballot in Maricopa County in the fall as well. And there is certainly a lot of pre-planning and important meetings that are happening, and public engagement and positioning and careful discussion on the referendum as we go forward in the next few months. MAG is doing a good job in terms of the networking and the promotion of it that they're doing. And I was listening to another podcast this morning and talking about being sure that you continue to press and put the facts out there across different channels and trying to get in front of people with those facts.
Yeah. So. And that one's interesting too. I think we talked with Ryan about that a little bit last time, but it's interesting, all the political machinations that had to happen for that vote to happen at all. I mean, you have this situation where you're not allowed to vote on any light rail extensions, right? It has to be all, transit service, and they're going to have some road stuff in there too, but it's a big ballot measure that happens, every 20 years? Is that right? It's like a 20-year ballot measure or something like that?
Yep. It is a 20-year ballot measure. They had tried with this latest legislation to extend it to 25, but I can't recall off the top of my head whether that is still in place or that got changed in the legislation. I'm going to a talk on Thursday morning to get a refresh on where things stand. It's now called Prop 479 here. It was Prop 400, but yeah. And you really tried to put together a plan like they have, it appears in Nashville, that it has something for everybody. So it makes it hard for anyone to say, I don't want to support that because of what you risk by not having something. I love all the transportation safety aspects that were included in this. Obviously, also the active transportation and the complete street measures. But again, this article is really clear in how they've laid it out in the plan in terms of really talking about it as multimodal safety and how we're framing what is being proposed, because we've seen it here in Arizona, and I know we're seeing it in other places in the country, a concerted, organized, I think, sort of organized effort to attack certain things, to weaponize words and like modes, like bicyclists. We've always seen that,
Yeah.
And so I feel like, again, that framing of what's being offered in the plans will be really important, and the words that are used to continue to talk about it.
The framing is, it's your move, Nashville. Let's go. Choose how you move. That's the framing that they chose. 285 bus stop upgrades, 12 transit centers, 17 park and rides, 2 bus garages, 65 new buses, 86 miles of sidewalks, 592 smart signals, and 39 miles of complete streets, including bikeway construction and safety improvements. I think there's some bus rapid transit, like, some queue jumps and stuff like that in there too. And also I saw mentioned in the article too that they're going to double bus service, or almost double bus service, which, when they did that in Charlotte in like 2005 or something, it produced really a lot of ridership improvement. So I imagine that it's going to have the same effect there as well. So that's really cool, and I'm looking forward to seeing what that happens. And I've been thinking about doing another election day show, so maybe we'll have to. That'd be great. We'll have to cover this, when it comes back around. This one, and then the one in Phoenix, in Maricopa County. So looking forward to kind of covering that and getting my mind off of whatever happens in that other world that day.
Well, and maybe you could have like, okay, we're going to cover transit measures and what states also have abortion access on the agenda, on their ballot, because I think we'll have that here too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Get out the vote.
Get out the vote.
Do you know of other places that are proposed to have transportation measures on the ballot?
Not yet, but the Center for Transportation Excellence always has a list of every ballot measure. And I think, Transit Center probably has some too sometimes where they put up what the transit measures are, but I think that CFTE always has like the lists of ballot measures that are happening that fall. And so that's how we got some of the speakers for the last YouTube show on election day. Was I was going through and kind of looking and seeing, and had a couple of folks come from different places based on that. So I'm sure there'll be a bunch of them, because presidential election years, they always like to have those out on the ballot. I think actually Seattle might be having one, a transportation levy. They're talking about like what's in it now, and I think local advocates are really frustrated because the mayor is really like making it too simple and not going hard enough. I mean, if you have these 20-year measures, I know it's hard politically, but you have to kind of go swing for the fences sometimes a little bit more than, be less conservative, because it is such a long time between the election and when the next one might happen where you can raise more money for transportation. Yeah. So I know that the Seattle folks have been frustrated with that process too. So we'll probably see, I think we'll see a lot of them around the country, because a lot of people come out to vote and they want to have it on that big ballot. With all that. So I know here in San Francisco Bay Area, we're having a housing ballot measure and so we're not having a transportation measure because, and I think Adina Levin actually sent in a message that I probably should read at some point. I mean, like on the show. I read it, Adina, I promise. But I mean, like on the show, I should probably read, because she has laid out kind of a good like framework of why each thing's happening. But, we're going to have a transportation levy probably in 2026, but the housing levy was 2024. So they couldn't put it on this ballot. So there's like all that political machination too. Like, should we be with a housing ballot, or should we have on some other stuff? There's like other things going on in the ballot too. So all those things are considered. All right, let's go to Milan, shall we? Let's go across the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah, well, I didn't know if you were gonna if that was a good segue to Colorado, since you were just talking about a housing measure. Oh yeah, that's true. Well, you know what? Let's go there and we'll come back to Milan. How's that? Zoning reform for transportation funding. Colorado's House Bill 1313, Housing in Transit-Oriented Communities, would promote housing density along transit corridors and employment districts. The bill, which passed the House and is now headed to the state Senate, or in the Senate right now, would provide municipalities with funding for technical assistance and studies to promote development. The catch is that places that don't comply will forfeit funding from the state's Highway Users Tax Fund. This was by Marianne Goodland in Colorado Politics. A few months back, I posted an article in the Federation of American Scientists, and there was two, and they'd ask for big ideas, right? They were like, they asked college students, they asked experts, they asked folks that give us some big ideas. And one of the big ideas was they said that, if a metro area had more than 30% of people rent burdened, they should be subject to loosening of zoning restrictions and like the builder's remedy here in California, where if you're not compliant with your general plan, you have to allow builders have to be able to build whatever they want. And if not, then if you don't go through that and don't have that, then you lose your highway funding. And so I saw that a couple months ago, and now here it is in Colorado. So I don't know if they're actually related, but it's interesting to see them putting that together. And we had talked about it on the Monday show when that actually came out, when that Federation of American Scientists thing came out, because basically the big example of this is Louisiana, right? When they didn't have drinking age above 21, they had it at 18. The federal government said, if you don't have it above 21, we're going to take away all your federal highway funding. And so they pumped it up, and it's 21 now. And so that's kind of an example of how that funding is leveraged as a way to get policy goals that some states want. And so here we are, fast forward, we're here in the Colorado legislature, and it's in the Senate right now. It's getting watered down as we speak. I think that they took the teeth out of pulling out the transportation funding teeth, where basically they say, if you don't do this, we're going to take away your funding, which goes to, I guess it's road
that was a pretty big stick.
Mostly. Yeah, it was a pretty big stick, right? And I appreciated that. But basically, and I tried to read the bill too, and I must say, it was kind of confusing about how they're setting things up in tiers and trying to the cities that are involved and not involved. It has to be near a transit line. How much affordable housing has to be, the density component, where'd that come from? They're like 40 units an acre. Well, some folks were saying that that's too much because that's really not feasible for developers and stuff like that. So there's all this stuff, but I think the main theme of the idea, and I think it might get killed too. So I think overall, I think this whole thing
swung too.
Maybe swung too hard, but I want to talk about kind of the overall theme of just tying transportation and land use ideas together. This idea of promoting transit-oriented development, promoting density near transit, making sure that you have this system that works together, and then basically saying, well, the opposite of this is road funding. We can use that as a stick to be like, you want your road funding, you want to repair your roads. If you don't do this other thing, you're gonna, lose the ability to do that. So we should tie them together. I'm interested what your thoughts are on that.
It's like we were just talking about with the transportation tax measures. You have different approaches, right? Can you create something that there's something for everyone? You're building your advocate bench, or are you pitting things against one another? So you're taking that approach in terms of,
you run the risk, right? You run the risk of alienating certain folks.
Yeah. And so that's the path they went here, it seems. Obviously, they've done their research to the degree to which they thought they could, how far it could run, and it seemed any of the article is talking about how several people voted for it with the confidence that it would get changed in the Senate, and that they wouldn't support it if it still remained the way it was when it left the House, but they wanted to show their support for the concept as a whole. But I think they ran that risk, as you said, of creating too much frustration and challenge. Sorry, I'm aging in place, so my words don't come to me as quickly. No. Yeah, it seemed like they were up against that question of local control too, and I think that is an important discussion.
In Colorado, they've been having this discussion the last two legislative sessions, and so last time a lot of bills that especially some of the signature housing bills, the governor wanted to push cities to think about absorbing more housing, got pushed away, and I think that they're trying different ways to kind of go around the edges to try to get more housing in these cities. But I also think they run the risk of being too complicated too. Like they you can have a percentage of this, and then if you do this, you get this percentage, and this, you have to have this much affordable inclusionary housing and blah, blah, blah. I think part of the problem with our housing system in the United States is we built all these layers on top of each other over time. And so now it's just like a morass of legislation and
Right.
and rules you have to follow. And I think that's really kind of a tough thing that we've created for developers and for people who want to build housing. That's like it especially affordable housing, right? It's like you have to have like 10 different sources of funding. You have to make sure that you have the land available, and you have to do this, that, and the other thing. And if you don't have this I dotted and T crossed, then you lose this funding. It's like, we're making this way too hard on ourselves. Like, we should just figure out how to build housing.
Yeah, my sister-in-law had the opportunity. She had land, and she had some of the finances to do some affordable housing development in South Carolina, and it took about 10 years.
10 years
to do it. And a lot of, I mean, she was exhausted by the time it actually happened, and it's a long story in terms of how it did, but that boggled my mind. And that's happening all over the place. This, as you said, this is part of the problem that we have, again, and just getting housing stock in the market in general, and then particularly affordable housing stock.
Certain folks don't want certain housing in their neighborhoods and those types of things, and I understand to a certain extent, but I understand where they're coming from. I don't agree with them. I feel like we're making it harder on ourselves by just not even allowing any housing to be built. I mean, there was, I think recently in San Francisco, they said they had permitted like 7 housing units, and like we have a shortage of tens of thousands, if not millions, in the state. 3.5 million in the state, I think, is the number now. But like 7 housing, that's not gonna move the needle. It's even making things worse, right? So let's build some housing, please.
I apologize, I haven't listened to the past few episodes, but did you talk about or have on a previous show about the housing legislation that passed in Utah?
No, I did not.
Yeah, we'll have to go research that and talk about it in the future, because I feel like I think I was listening to NPR or something, maybe they might have, or Fresh Air, maybe maybe some episode on NPR, and that might be like a housing trust fund type situation.
I mean, there's so much. That's the thing too, is there's so much stuff going on. I can't keep track of everything. I try to, but it's hard. But there's so much stuff. I mean, Montana was doing stuff. Obviously, Oregon and Washington have been having discussions about this. I think Washington's the stuff that they were doing got pushed back in their state legislature. I think that's the case. I'm sure people correct me if I'm wrong. We talked with Jim Kuman this week on the podcast about what's happening in Minnesota. And so the stuff that happened for the Minneapolis 2040, and then also in St. Paul, but then they're also trying to make this like state legislation happen, and it got pushed back to the density stuff. So it's hard to keep track of everything that's happening. And also there's a lot of states that are trying, like here in California, Alex Lee is trying to get like a social housing bill passed, where they're following what happened in Virginia, where, I think it was the county, I think it was Arlington County. It was one of the places around DC that had, or maybe it was in Prince George's, or maybe it was one of the counties around DC. And they had built some social housing by basically, being a funder in a developer's project for a market rate project. But then instead of, because they were the majority funder, they get the majority profits. But instead of taking the profits, they were just made, you allowed those units to be at below market rates. So they didn't, they didn't make back. So from that type of experiment in social housing, from becoming the state or the county or whoever, becoming the developer and starting to build units that were just like any other unit, a developer built them and everything, but they're not like the same it's not the same process as like an affordable housing project where you put together this tranches of funding sources and all that stuff. You're just like, hey, developer, we have money, build this project, and then we'll take our profits as lower rents, and you can take your profits as whatever the regular thing is. So you build 300 unit, development projects, and you can actually, make a dent in it. So there's so much going around the country. I'm interested to see what actually Utah did, because I'm sure it's interesting.
Yeah, I just looked it up. Utah legislature and the governor's office worked together to pass a package of bills that focus less on subsidies and more on free market policies. Created a new slate of tools cities and developers can use to pay for infrastructure or other needs, hoping to pave the way for more affordable single-family housing projects. They opted to play nice and walk a fine line, drafting legislation without upsetting cities worried about losing zoning authority or local control, also balancing home builder and developer interests. That's all fluff. So let's see.
Yeah. Also, Utah is they continue to sprawl too, and they're losing. There's a lot less space in the Wasatch Valley now. Than there used to be, and so they're going to have to start densifying. In order to, they're running out of space.
Yeah,
like
we're doing a
fair
fair amount of projects out there.
Yeah.
Clarify state code, place certain requirements on cities to accept and complete applications for residential development. Yeah, I mean, they pass like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is a future Thursday show.
That's right. We have to get off to get at my housing beat.
That's right.
This one with Jim we just did was a 2-parter too, so I hope folks get to listen to that one because it was really fun talking with Jim. We're old friends, and he's been doing his own development in Minnesota, and lots of really cool stuff going on there. And his project, the Sundial building, I mean, it looks like an old warehouse, but it's a brand new build. And so we talked about design and all that stuff, and what makes a good building, and a lot of the the innovative resilience stuff that he put in there as well. The solar panels and the water catchment and the stuff like that. It's really cool what he's doing with his wife, Faith, and they're doing some really cool work. Let's talk about car exhaust. What a fun segue, right?
I thought you were going to go to design.
No, we'll save Milan for last.
Because you just said Milan for last,
and we'll hang out there
last.
Right. Yeah.
That's great. I like ending.
Car exhaust and Alzheimer's. New research from the University of Technology at Sydney, UTS, found a connection between vehicle exhaust and Alzheimer's symptoms in mice. Magnetite, a particle found in car exhaust, dust from brake pads, and coal-fired power emissions, is small enough to pass through the blood-brain barrier. And researchers at UTS say that magnetite can induce signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. If replicated in humans, this may have implications for neighborhoods choked with exhaust, school pickup and drop-off, as well as cycling and jogging along major roads. This was by David Waterworth in Clean Technica. So fewer than 1% of Alzheimer's cases are inherited, so it is likely that the environment and lifestyle play a key role in the development of the disease. That was kind of the main quote I took away from the bulk of the article, was that there's something else causing this problem, and they believe part of it might be this magnetite, which is in a lot of exhaust from vehicles, as well as some other things, brake dust and coal-fired power plants. What did you take from this one?
I definitely thought I need to go and find this research article and read it, because there was a lot of correlation that was discussed. And
I also saw a recent article. That nose picking was causing Alzheimer's too. So there's a number of things out there, right?
Yeah. Association is not causation. So I think it's intriguing, and it kind of adds to the list of health conditions that have an association, a possible association with particulate matter from vehicles. And, yet another reason why we should work to have the air be cleaner from many, many sources. The fossil fuels, I mean, it does come from brake. They said that the magnetite is in brake pad wear also. So it's just all vehicles.
Yeah. Electric vehicles won't solve that.
And again, like it goes back to, we really need to be able to reduce exposure through many different ways. But I would love to stop the idling in the school lines.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, all those pictures.
Or stop the school lines completely.
Yeah. I was talking with somebody the other day, like when I was a kid, we rode our bikes and walked to school. I mean, even in Bakersfield, I walked to school, right? Like I remember the route. I can see it in my head right now, and walking to Laurel Glen Elementary School. Yeah, I really enjoyed that too. I was a little bit of a free range kid in that way, getting to walk to and from school. But and I had friends' houses along the way that you could stop in if you needed to. But it was really interesting to think about how far it's come in terms of like how much driving people do to get their kids to school, and then how much punishment you might get if you let your kid decide to walk to school or decide to be more free range, right? Like there's all these stories about police officers picking up kids and then charging the parents because they let their kids out of the house without supervision. And so that's a big thing. But yeah, I mean, going back to this the idea of like the connection between Alzheimer's and particulates and exhaust, I don't doubt that there's probably some sort of a connection. I mean, I feel like there's been a lot of research about car pollutants in general connected to Alzheimer's. They might have found the specific thing that it is. And I was really interested to, basically what they're showing, I'm not sure how they figure out whether mice have Alzheimer's or not. That's kind of an interesting idea to me too. But the idea of cadavers and pulling the little particles of metal out of their brains was that's what struck me, was because, basically they did this process where to get the metal out, they would take, cadavers, the brains, and they would melt away the brain with acid or whatever it is. And then what's left is this metal pieces, and that they got with magnets, right? So they could find these little things that were spherical, which is not usually how magnetite, exists in nature. It has to be produced that way from whatever pollution or whatever that is. And so that connection was that, they found these proteins around the brain that are associated with, the Alzheimer's and whatever happens there. So I do think that there's, we always have to be cautious about causation, correlation, that connection and making that thing. But I also think this is a really interesting kind of step in making sure that we, cover our bases in terms of figuring out what it is and trying to find out all possible links to this horrible, horrible disease that is just, it's soul sucking at the end of someone's life.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned it earlier in the show, right?
We have, my mother-in-law has Alzheimer's and my father-in-law has dementia. So it's very difficult.
Double
for sure.
There.
Yeah. And that 1% to statistics, I'm on the Alzheimer's Association website right now because I was struck by that. I was like, really? It's less than 1% of Alzheimer's cases are caused by deterministic genes that cause the disease rather than increasing the risk of developing a disease, which is different than, slightly different than family history.
Okay.
Yeah.
I often wonder about we talked about the school car line, but when I was running track and cross country, we'd run up Guadalupe all the time, and thinking about how much we exposed ourselves to car, we could run on Town Lake, but then to get back to school, you had to run on major streets to get back to the university. So, throughout my lifetime, I'd probably run tens of thousands of miles, and a lot of that was probably on streets that had a lot of cars driving by and pollution and stuff like that. And so, not that I worried too much about it, because it's something that's probably going to happen in the future, but it's interesting to think about how much exposure I got to, not just, those type of particulates, but any type of, pollution or, stuff you pulled into your lungs or through your nose. It's just it just sucks one way or the other, whether you're going to get a disease from it later on in life or whether you're breathing it in at the moment, and it just makes your kind of hack up after a run. Yeah.
Jeff, you think back to, like you said, when we met and you were sitting in the class on community planning and public health, and
that's right.
We're talking about the disproportionate impacts of some communities based on where their housing is sited and their exposure to transportation pollutants, because their housing is sitting next to a freeway, and the exposure that comes from that. And I think that years and years and years of that exposure, and we talked about it from the standpoint of asthma and air quality, respiratory issues.
Yeah.
But again, the research continues to show that it's a multitude of health issues that are associated with poor air quality and contaminants and poor air quality.
Which is frustrating, because we also just talked to Megan Kimball, who wrote a book about city limits, about the expansion of highways in Texas, I-45, I-35, I-345 in Dallas. And, those impacts don't seem to register in NEPA documents at all is frustrating. And even outside of Texas, and recently I think we talked about this one as well on the show, but there's a cap on a highway in Colorado, in Denver, going back to Colorado again, where the parents are like, well, maybe we shouldn't let our kids play on the highway cap because that's where all the pollution kind of captures up, right? That's where a lot of the air quality problems that we're having in our houses, because we live near the cap or live near the highway, are happening as well. And so, you can cap a highway, but it doesn't take away all the pollution that happens along the highway too. So
yeah, what's the mitigation or the removal plan for the pollutants that are being captured?
Yeah. Anyways, it's frustrating, but it's just one of those things that we continue to try to work on, and whether we can figure out what the problem is and what's causing what. I think the discussion about Alzheimer's, dementia, other things related to what's happening in people's brains is going to continue. And I'm going to guess that this is going to be a major part of it. It just seems like there's some connection there, but yeah, we'll see. Let's go to Milan. Although this one isn't as happy. I mean, it's a happy ending because we're in Milan, but I don't know if it's a happy ending generally. Design Week has changed Milan. Milan, Italy, famous for its quote-unquote weeks, including Design Week and Fashion Week. But those short bursts of activity have also changed the commercial real estate market as property owners are drawn to the lure of short-term rentals and aggressive gentrification occurs. The events have changed, too, from places of experimentation and conviviality to overcrowded and overhyped scenes. This is by Lucia Tozzi in Domus Web. This caught my eye when I was searching for articles. I always search, I've seen so much news over the last, since 2006 when I started the newsletter, almost 20 years now I've been doing this, that I'm not bored. It's just like there's stuff that continues and comes around every once in a while. But this one struck me because I was like, this is new, or this is interesting because it's different.
I had not thought about this or heard about this, the Airbnb of these spaces,
of commercial spaces, like hangars or warehouses or things like that, right? Like, it was just fascinating to me that you could have this neighborhood where it was really popular to have a design week or a fashion week or whatever, and then basically the rest of the year, when you didn't have these weeks, these spaces were empty because you can make more money on those couple of weeks a year than you could just having a regular tenant, which is basically speaks to the Airbnbization of like hotels, right? A hotel or like, short-term rental stays and things like that. But I hadn't heard it from this kind of standpoint of a commercial spaces, which I just thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, I had not heard of that either, and she does a great job of painting the picture and really kind of setting the stage in terms of, as she said, it's going to be easy for me to find this property that this client is searching for, and I see empty storefronts all the time. I know that it's available out there, but it's not, because it's locked up. It is locked up for this is the fear that people had always had. One of the fears with like the short-term rental trend is that, what does that do to the community, to the neighborhood, to the opportunity for vitality and growth and economic impact? Obviously, this is saying they're banking on a short-term economic impact that has a high value for not only the person who owns the property, but for the neighborhood as a whole. But has that borne out in the true analysis? You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of parking.
Short-term benefit. There's empty spaces, right? All the time. These empty parking lots, they store cars, but nothing. You park your car there, but nothing else really. I mean, it just that popped in my head just now. It's like, oh, that's parking. It's parking because it kind of clears out a space and it's empty. That you can park your car there. Cars are empty 90% of the time, right? Maybe even more. 95%.
Parking lots or garages.
But I'm just thinking of like surface parking lots in cities, right? Like when you think about how a lot of cities were, how their economies, faltered, was they knocked down a lot of the buildings that had retail businesses or other commercial entities and put a parking lot, because one other business was like, well, I need parking for customers to come see me, so I'm going to mess up the commercial space next to me. So this is like kind of a similar feel where you have these short-term commercial rentals in Milan, in these neighborhoods that host these weeks. And they're just parked, right? They're just parked, just like an Airbnb is parked until somebody comes and live with it. It has a benefit to the person that comes and stay there, but it's not the benefit for the community overall. I mean, and they're talking about in this article specific to the neighborhoods, the ideas of gentrification of the neighborhood, really not being able to get any momentum in terms of creating a neighborhood kind of feel or vitality that suffers as well, as you mentioned.
Yeah, because I think the other theme that she was touching on is that it's not an investment in the neighborhood. As soon as that loses its value for whoever is occupying or owns that space or is utilizing that space for Design Week, if 2 or 3 years down the line that neighborhood is not as cool or trendy or whatever, it's abandoned and they move on to the next location. So it's not commitment and investment in the space, it's commodification. It's just extracting from the neighborhood as opposed to contributing to the neighborhood like a long-term business would do.
Yeah. Yeah. I was trying to think if there's like any examples in the United States of this type of stuff happening aside from Airbnb and like the housing situation. But like I was trying to think of any commercial, like any major festivals or things or something that happens. I mean, I knew New York has its fashion weeks and stuff like that, but I don't know if this same type of commercial kind of gentrification / like sitting actually happens. I was trying to think of ACL or like, you know, South by Southwest. Those are once a year things, but they don't really, you know, nobody really saves a space for that 1 week throughout the whole year. And so I guess it's just a function of kind of Milan's specific place in creating these weeks. But I was trying to think of like an example, but I couldn't, which is probably why it was interesting to me because it was so rare.
I'm trying to think, you know, we have a month and a half period here in Phoenix and Scottsdale and proper every year that it's like it's like one event after another. That's what came to my mind to look and do some research on as to whether something like this happens, that it's like like you said, it's a space that sits empty otherwise, but during that 4 to 6 to 8 week period, it's occupied. It's not the same thing in terms of, I think it really is truly commercial spaces, so it doesn't have the same impact in terms of the commute. Well, it could be a different type of impact potentially. Yeah. But
maybe a football stadium is another example too, right? 8 weeks a year where it's used and then all the rest of it. I mean, I guess they're used for other things too, for other sporting events and things like that sometimes, but it just feels like a big investment for and extraction, right, from the owners.
We have a project right now where we're having this discussion regarding a potential multimodal and bike improvement that can go into an area that would have a daily impact, but you know, there's some resistance by a party that likes to use part of that space for events that they feel bring a significant economic impact, so they don't necessarily want that facility going through that space. That is a road, but they use it for other things. So we're still trying to come about, find a solution for that. That's part of a project we're on. So
cool. Well, this week and every week on Thank Our Generous, how's this for a segue from? We're segueing all over the place. This week and every week on Thank Our Generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without it, so thank you very much. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month will get you one of our transportation scarves. Also, I want to mention we did produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning and Practice. If you want to get your hands on one, it shows up like a podcast. Go to raymondunwin.com. Listener questions and comments. I'll get to Adina's comment at some point, I know, but it was actually a long letter, so maybe in the future I'll get back to it. I promise, Adina, I'll get back to your note. If you have comments or questions, feel free to tweet at us or comment on any of the social sites where the podcast appears. We're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter. I still haven't updated the Twitter app on my phone, so it still is a little blue bird. Yeah, it's X now. But I still call it Twitter. It's still a little blue bird on my phone too. I still haven't updated the app. Every time I have to go through, instead of saying update all, I have to go through individually just to spite them. Maybe I'm just spiting myself. I don't know, but we're on all the social sites. So so find us there and comment on the show. And here we got Puppies and Butterflies, one of our favorite parts of the show. This is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in the other sections. Tracy, do you have any Puppies and Butterflies this week?
Gosh, I forgot about Puppies and Butterflies. Well, puppies. I know that we were at a restaurant the other day and the NFL draft was on one of the TVs that was showing in the restaurant. And it was a segment where I think they were doing an adoption segment. So there were actual puppies that were being shown during the NFL draft, which was in Detroit. And it sounds like it was a very popular
700,000 people.
Yeah, crazy. Yeah,
that's
crazy
a lot
event.
Of people.
Yeah, but there was, I guess, puppy adoption being promoted.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think, they do the Puppy Bowl during the Super Bowl.
Oh,
so
yeah.
they're probably up with that too. So yeah, that's great. I love, my sister got a puppy recently too. They're the cutest. Little black lab. And they got such big paws,
Oh, yeah.
the big hands. So my Puppies and Butterflies is just like this random thought. And I posted this on Twitter, but last week I was in jury duty. I got called in I was supposed, so the week before I went to China, I got called into jury duty, and they asked, "Oh, does anybody have any extenuating circumstance where we can't be on the jury next week?" And I was like, "Well, I have a month-long trip to China coming up next week, so can I come back later?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure." So basically, when I get back, I got another jury summons, and so I had to go in. And so I'm waiting for them to call us as a jury, and just like they play this video and they tell you like how important it is and to be a juror, and it's one of our rights as Americans to be tried by our peers and things like that if we do something wrong. But I was also thinking like, why do we only have juries for like criminal trials? Why can't we have these for like transportation projects? Why can't we set up a jury for like, if you're making this improvement or you're doing this project, like why can't you set up a jury and then have like arguments on both sides and then try to convince the jurors whether this is a good idea or not? So I feel like if we had juries for like Vision Zero, for example, or transportation projects, we'd actually maybe convince more people than maybe having this angry discussion every time about people in the neighborhood losing their access. There's recently this really unfortunate story here in San Francisco. I don't know if you heard about it, but a whole family was killed by a driver, like 4 people, 2 young kids and the parents. And Myrna Mulgar, who's the supervisor in that district, was like, okay, well, the MTA came up with this idea. Let's redesign the street so that, basically nobody's crossing into Muni area. We're going to make it so that you have to go around. You won't have to be able to go through. We're going to make it safer, make it more plaza where the Muni trains turn, more walkable and that stuff. And the merchants, basically are pushing back against it. And so they're like, let's form a committee. Everything you can do to kind of block something from actually happening after this sad event. And I was like, if for that specific event, right? And then afterwards you had to go and look at the road and say, we're having a jury look at this of our peers, and we have to argue about, the safety measures that are going to go in. That wouldn't happen, right? The person who was the prosecutor versus the person who's the defender, the prosecutor or whoever was set up to be defending the humans on the road would win in that sense. I feel like somebody would appeal to people's humanity. But the way the system's set up now, it just doesn't work that way. So that's kind of my random thought is like, what if we did have like, our service to our country, our service to our fellow residents of a city is not just whether they were guilty of a crime, but whether we could make people safer.
Well, I mean, I'm more cynical than you that we could actually win hearts and minds through that way. I hope that we could. And we do have public engagement processes for projects and plans and things that happen in our communities and whether people engage in them or not. And we present to councils and in a sense that's not necessarily a jury of our peers, and it's a jury of our electeds when we're making a case for a project, though there is public comment and people can come in and provide their support or not. The other thing you referenced Vision Zero and how we could do that. Some cities do have like rapid response teams. So if an incident happens, and I can't recall whether San Francisco does or not, then they have a group of designated individuals across different departments that go to the site of the incident to examine what happened. And if maybe you could have a citizen representative that was part of that process too, but not exactly what you were getting at, but
yeah, I mean, we have citizen advisory committees and we have advisory boards, but they're always like, political appointees or like handpicked by certain political, advocates and things like that. And maybe the jury system would get rigged up like that too, right? Like where, you had somebody got picked or didn't get picked because of where they lived or something like that. So I'm just trying to reimagine what like a good process would be. Cause I know we have, and like you mentioned, we have like the ability to input and things like that, but you always are inputting in like what you're most passionate about, right? Or what you're most angry about or what you're most like, but like, imagine if you had like 5 even keeled people that are like, I don't really have generally I like public safety, but I don't really have like an idea either way of whether I feel a certain way about this safety project. But maybe if I was like, sold, or not sold, that's the wrong word, but maybe if I was convinced by, the evidence that this would be a good project or a bad project, we can make decisions that way. But that's maybe just my hope that we could do things better than we do now, which is like, it just feels really bad.
Well, I'll give you hope that we do that on projects. Like we just finished a project with the city of West Sacramento that was a sidewalk transportation equity program. And then we've kicked off a comprehensive safety action plan with them, or a Vision Zero plan. And in both cases, we do have a community advisory committee that is representative of people across the city, geographic and economic and racial and ethnic diversity. So, and we're just starting out, but that is meant to be the discussion and to kind of have that debate with one another in terms of somebody may feel more passionate about this place or this project or that project or this improvement, but it has to be in the spirit of allowing one another a voice and then coming and providing feedback throughout the overall project period to help us to come to a list of prioritized actions. So there are processes that happen in projects. And I know I'm telling you what you already know. It just doesn't look like
it just popped in my head as I was sitting there waiting. We got released. I
think that's a good butterfly.
Yeah, we got released because apparently, like just before that, they had determined that they couldn't continue with the trial for some reason or another. So they said, well, it sounds like you guys are going to be let go because the trial can't continue for this specific case. And we're like, okay, so just let us all go. We'll see you again in a year, or whenever they call us for duty.
Yep, I was just on jury duty or like on the list to be called in, and didn't have to go, but. Yeah, I was available.
Yeah,
if needed. Yeah.
Well, Tracy, where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
They can only find me on LinkedIn nowadays because I did not continue when things moved from Twitter to X, which is sad because I loved my Twitter community, but I did not love what was happening in that community as a whole. So
I understand.
So I left, but I love the LinkedIn community, so people can find me there.
Nice.
And Tracy McMillan.
I stayed, and I know that there's a lot of folks have differing opinions on whether you should stay or go, but I'm still there. There's still a lot of folks there arguing and fighting the good fight as well as being evil. So you can find me on Twitter. I'll call it Twitter until I die. You'll find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire or at TheOverheadWire.com. You can find me on Mastodon, The Overhead Wire, sfba.social. You can find me on Threads, on Instagram at The Overhead Wire. You can also find me on LinkedIn as well. So find me and say hi there too. I'm there. I'm always lurking. We have our transit-oriented development group as well, where I post articles specific to that topic in there. So check that out if you get a chance. Thanks for joining us on Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks, Tracy, for coming on the show.
Thanks, Jeff, for having me again. And yes, I am looking forward to getting back on a regular schedule.
Let's get on a regular schedule. It sounds good.
Yeah. As much as you want to schedule.
Yeah, I know. I'm so bad at scheduling.
Yeah. Well, you have a toddler now, so.
I know, but that's not a good excuse for scheduling ahead of time things. But I guess it is kind of to a certain extent. Yeah. And thanks to our generous Patreons for sponsoring this week's podcast. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Talking